So the first week of the Summer Showdown has been an interesting one. We've had upset matches, upset players, but probably most importantly the introduction of a new hero and a new meta comp. But don't stress if you don't understand the Queen comp too well just yet, because half the Overwatch League teams don't either. And that's also the reason I'm here, to guide us through the comps and playstyles of the Overwatch League so we can actually understand what we're watching on the broadcast. So let's hop into the first episode of my Overwatch League viewing guide. Now, obviously for this first week, the most important thing is the Junker Queen comp. We've seen a couple small variations, but broadly speaking, every map ends up in this mirror. What makes it so strong versus other comps is, of course, the double speed boost. Comps that rely on Lucio speed boost to rush a target have always been decent, but they've been traditionally countered by comps that can play for angles. Since Lucio comps typically have closer range brawl heroes and AoE healers, they struggle to get resources to players outside of the main group, and so can't really skirmish for map control versus backlines like Ana Zen. If the enemy is able to abuse that angle control, they can force the Lucio team to run a gauntlet of damage to push a target, usually with their flankers engaging as well, which gives them a good chance of catching that engage on a lot of maps. However, once we add Queen with her second speed boost, the distance that we can reach targets from has just massively increased. So when teams try that traditional counter of taking angles, it usually just opens up someone to being rushed. What was once a great angle is now a dangerous position, not just because the Queen comps can reach you, but also because of the overheal allowing their backline to comfortably follow through with a push, even if they end up running through enemy LOS, meaning that Queen comps can get onto their target before any of the enemy's other angles can do anything meaningful. Even something like a Tracer chasing behind your rotation just isn't going to do anything versus an overhealed and speed boosted backline. And this is why the comp is so universal. Since versus a comp as fast and tanky as JOATS, taking wide angles means the enemy can either punish you before your team can help, or push your team before you can help. I think this really is the first comp since GOATS that can actually push the central position between two enemy angles, driving themselves like a wedge between the two units, then turning to focus one down. I'm not fully convinced there isn't a counter, but with Doom nerfed and this comp being so reliable with great ult cycles, no Western team has committed to anything funky just yet. But let's look at how teams actually play in the mirror. First, we gotta understand the default setup, which is a response to that threat of getting pushed with the double boost. There's two main overlapping concepts here, personal escape options and the threat of a trade. Every player wants to be as aggressive as possible, while still being able to use their personal cooldowns such as dash, slide and bash to escape if the enemy try and push them, trading that movement cooldown for all that enemy time and attention. We can also see Queen's health pool as well as the team's various boops and slows as part of their escape options too, because remember the goal isn't necessarily to escape. In fact, with a double speed boost, if a Queen comp wants you dead, they're probably going to catch you. The goal is just to absorb a disproportionate amount of resources while doing it, so if the enemy really want to chase your brig after she bashes away, the rest of your squad should be able to trade out pretty effectively. Anything like those boobs or slows that help you absorb extra resources can be considered part of your escape option. Queen is kind of the odd one out on the team though, since she can't fully escape from the front line with just her shout, but that's okay because the default setup is here to cover for her. She can play super tight on the corner, where if the enemy hard push her, she can kite back with shout, using her health pool, her self-heal, her pocket from the supports, Sojourn slow, and the boops from the supports, to still absorb that disproportionate amount of resources despite not actually running away, which combined with the enemy being forced to swing around the corner to hit the Queen, and so opening themselves up to the rest of her team, means that they can again trade out pretty effectively on all that attention the Queen is taking. And that threat of the trade really is the other crucial part of this default setup. With the difficulty in stabilizing in 5v5, we can't afford to dump all our resources into just keeping the rush target alive. Not only are they probably still going to die if the whole enemy team can follow through, but using all of our resources defensively means the enemy are free to keep pressuring us and just kind of snowball the fight. Instead, we need to be able to trade on the enemy team when they push, which should zone out members of their team from following through, which ends up being a much more efficient resource trade, because the initial rush target won't need as much peel, and if the enemy team are really insistent on chasing that target, then chances are we can actually trade kills to our advantage, assuming of course that the initial target played in a way that again absorbed that disproportionate amount of resources. Aside from chances to get kills, that trading process will ideally split the enemy team, zoning out their backline and making their frontline into focusable targets, where a couple of our members can stay forward to keep the backline zoned, while the rest of us turn around and deal with whoever's behind us. The threat of teams trading like this versus enemy pushes is what controls a lot of the tempo in the Junker Queen mirror, both by forcing teams to mirror the default setup and making them spend time to play for a clear advantage before they hard commit. So those two concepts are really where we get the default setup from. The Queen plays close on the corner, ready to lead a push or a trade, as well as kite on the corner to absorb an enemy push. Genji usually plays across the choke from her and ideally up on high ground, the two of them together putting out the majority of that trade threat. Once the supports have helped the Sojourn into position, they play close enough to the Queen that they can either follow through with a push or help her with heals and boops, while also being far back enough that they can escape versus an enemy push, and Sojourn just peeks as aggressively as she can while still being able to escape with her slide. And we should see teams rock around in this setup pretty much all the time, but a lot of teams just aren't that good at it yet, so we see them run around stacked as 5 and get punished for it. Here we see a good example of Toronto running this default on Queen Street versus Atlanta, where they're about to take this rough setup that enables them to skirmish while having their escapes open and having the threat of a trade when Atlanta push. Atlanta walk up and see a chance to dash onto Hisu with Shout. Hisu slides away, while Hopper immediately starts the trade with Rampage, which zones Kai and forces B. Atlanta attempt to follow through, but because of Toronto's initial setup, Twilight and Hisu were able to escape, while their frontline have an easy time trading out on Atlanta's Brig and Queen. Playing the fight through from the beginning, hopefully we can see how that default setup denies those types of hard opening commitments. Teams do have to start fights somehow though, and here we usually see a default play involving the Genji and the Queen. After taking the default setup, the Genji can look to dash in, usually onto a Brig or Sojourn, in a way that will force the enemy to turn and put attention onto him. At the same time, his team can push up, using the distraction he creates, using Shout to keep him alive, and meeting him in the fight without having to burn through their health pools closing the distance. Once they reach the fight, they should still have amp to either continue pushing if they have an advantage, or disengage if the enemy use a bunch of ults. Often, this process will actually end up splitting the frontline and backline a little, for example, forcing a defensive bash or slide, and so giving the team a chance to get an advantage in the frontline. And this actually works fairly similar to Reaper Zarya, where a Reaper can TP in with a Zarya bubble to make the same type of distraction, while his team closes distance or clears whichever targets have been split. And we see a good example of this on the first fight, where Toronto closed distance to the statue and commit a dash to force both bash and slide defensively, which then opens up a chance to turn around and kill Hawk in the front line. There is obviously other cooldowns used as part of this default, but the dash to zone the Brig or Sojourn is the foundation of the fight. We see another example of it in this fight, except where both teams are also using ultimates. Toronto open the fight with a dash and Shout, but this time also with the Blade. Then, once they see the enemy use double support ult, they use their amp to disengage and stabilize with their own rally. Again, it's the same default, but this time with an added Blade. It's a simple default that fits the comp really well, but teams haven't really nailed it just yet. Here's a clip from Gladiators vs Outlaws, where we see a great chance for one of these pushes. If Kevster dashes in just before his team push across point, he can make a distraction that should enable them to close distance safely, while he's able to survive this kind of traditionally risky play because of Queen's Shout. Instead, we just see Gladiators walk up and get brutally traded on by Outlaw's initial default setup. There is a lot more to the Queen comp, but I've not been that impressed by most teams in this first week, so this first episode is more on the foundations of what to expect. In future episodes, I want to focus more on specific matches and unique team playstyles. Overall though, it's a comp that requires constant discipline. If a player isn't ready to react with their escapes, or forgets to call an important cooldown, it will put you into a disadvantage with no chance to stabilize. That requirement for discipline is why we've seen so many upsets, with high quality but potentially lazy players that are too comfortable with their spot in the tier lists, struggling versus teams that are working hard and really nailing that discipline. For this weekend of games, be on the lookout for that default setup and that default playstyle. It'll be interesting to see which of the teams that struggled actually have a good enough team environment to sort themselves out. Keep an eye out for any counter comps played by the East region, and my one to watch is probably going to be Toronto versus Dallas. These teams have impressed me a lot during the first week in terms of their default setups, so I think this is where we'll see the cleanest mirror matchup. Thanks for watching, and if you got any ideas about the format, please let me know. It's more of an experiment at the moment, but like I said, I want to focus more on specific matches in the future.